Um, but yeah, welcome. I'm Kathleen Morgan from the library, and we're so excited to see you for another round of dessert and a movie. And tonight we're going to talk about the documentary, The Birth of Sake, or Sake. And yeah, it was a beautifully made movie, and I'm excited to hear more. And I wanted to introduce you to Therese Winters, who is our info services librarian, who's going to be joining us for these movie sessions and also our wine sessions. And so Therese, I'll let you take it away and introduce Dr. Rath, and we can get the conversation going.
All right. Well, lovely to see all of you. I think I briefly met all of you before, but wonderful to be here. Our guest speaker this evening is Dr. Eric C. Rath from the Department of History at KU. He specializes in Japanese culture and food culture and history. He's published a few books. He's working currently, I believe, on a book about the history of sake. So he should have a lot of interesting information to share with us. So welcome, Dr. Eric Rath. Just to start off, do you want to kind of tell us a little bit about your travels and research that you've done in Japan? Anything you want to share with us?
Sure. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Teresa, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here. Yeah, I've been in KU since 1999, and pretty much all that time I've been focused on pre-modern Japanese history, traditional history, specifically food. And my most recent book you can find in the public library, which is Oishi. It's the history of sushi. And I'm writing a book right now on the history of sake. I thought, I would write one book about Japanese food and be done with it, but it's a very rich and broad topic, and there just seems to be so much more to learn. I'm always confronted with my own ignorance when I research this topic, because there's so much to it. And I like food for teaching too. I teach a course on the history of sushi and a couple other food history classes, and it's a very tangible topic. It's something everybody can relate with. Food, it's very intimate, and so it's so easy to spark a discussion about food or about alcohol. And so I hope you prove me right in that assumption tonight. I thought I would start just by saying a couple things, maybe 7 things is what I came up with. What are the 7 most important things to know about sake, or the 7 things that'll make you sound smart about sake? So this is my top 7 list. So if you'll indulge me for just a few minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. The first one is, of course, the pronunciation, and that's sake. Not sake. Somehow when I hear sake, I wince.
Yeah.
So,
well, you're going to wince
sake.
probably a lot tonight.
No, I mean, it's okay. It's okay. But I just thought, for your reference, it's sake.
Okay.
And don't let anybody else tell you any different.
Everybody say that, sake.
Right. Right. I was in a liquor store in Lawrence once, and the guy said, "Oh, you bought some sake," and I winced. And I said, "No, it's sake." And he said, "No, it's sake." And I said, "No, it's not." Anyway, you'll know from now on that it's sake. So that's number 1. And number 2, a lot of people will refer to sake as a rice wine, but it's not. It's not like a wine at all. It's more like a beer in the way it's made. We can talk about that, but I mean, that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, because wine, well, when you have wine, as you know, you are involved in this wine class as well. Wine naturally ferments. The grapes will naturally ferment, but that doesn't work that way with sake. You need to have a process like beer. Beer, you malt grains. Sake, they do it differently. So it's more like a beer than it is like a wine. And it's not distilled. It's not like a vodka. In the movie, I'm sure you didn't see people boiling the sake to get some sort of essence out of it and then distilling it. That doesn't happen. They do that with other things in Japan. They do that with shochu, but not with sake. So that's point 2. Point 3, serving temperature. You'll get a lot of people saying to you, oh, your sake has to be served hot, hot, hot. And others will say, no, 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 no. It needs to be cold, cold, cold. Well, the secret is either one is okay. And that's the remarkable thing about sake. Unlike most every other beverage that you can think of, you can serve sake hot, you can serve it cold, you can serve it room temperature, and it's all good. And I encourage you to do that. Get a bottle, try it at different temperatures, and you'll see how the flavor of that sake changes. That's the remarkable thing about sake. You know, you can't do that with Diet Coke. I mean, you can, but it's going to be a mess. That's my 3rd point. 4th point, pairing. You might read a lot of people who say, oh, sake pairs with this, or it doesn't pair with that. And I know that's such a big deal with wine, and it's starting to be a big deal with sake, but it's okay. Sake goes with everything. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of sake, but don't be afraid to try it with whatever, with your mochi, for example, or with your dessert or whatever. It's fine. So don't let anybody bully you about pairing the sake. Oh, it only goes with this or it doesn't go with that. That's all nonsense. That's very recent stuff. So you drink it whatever way you want it. 5th thing I think we're on now, and that's avoid the cheap stuff, you know? And there's some brands I could steer you away from. So something that's kind of on the bottom shelf for sake, it's not going to be the best drinking experience. I mean, you could try it if you've never had it before, but I don't recommend it. And my 6th point is avoid this expensive stuff too. If you go into your favorite liquor store in Lawrence or wherever, and you see a bottle of 30, 40 sake, and you think, sake, don't do it. Because chances are that bottle has been sitting there for months or years or whatever. And unless you know someone at the store who can verify that that is a bottle that's very new, it could have gone bad. Because why? Because sake does not age. You need to drink sake within 1 year. Otherwise, the flavor profile will change, especially if it's been sitting in the light and all that. So don't buy expensive sake locally. My last one, point 7, is a bit of a controversial one. Okay, so bear with me. I have to say this to undergraduates a lot. And that's don't put sake in beer. Maybe you've heard of beer, or what is it? Sake bombs. People put sake in beer. I'm like, no, don't do that, please. And flavored sake, I don't know how you feel about that. There's some flavored sake out on the market. I would steer away from that. If you really want to try the sake, enjoy its own flavor without the mango or the strawberry or whatever has been put in there. I don't know how you feel about flavored beer, but it's kind of similar to me. I don't want to drink a blueberry beer, you know, or a pumpkin beer.
We have.
But I even less don't want to drink a pumpkin flavored sake. So that's my 7 points. Sake pronunciation. Sake is not a rice wine. It's more like a beer. Any serving temperature is great. Any pairing is great. Don't buy the cheap stuff. Don't buy the real expensive stuff. And please don't put your sake in your beer.
Words of wisdom from Dr. Rath.
Yeah.
That's what you get for 20 years of studying food.
All in a nutshell. It's fabulous.
All in a nutshell, yeah, it's all for you folks.
It's
This
great.
is water, not sake.
Yeah, I'm already so much more educated on sake. So thank you for that.
Nice job.
I do have a question. I have heard that there is sparkling sake. Is that something you would recommend or not recommend, or is that a sort of modern creation, or?
It is more of a modern creation, and it's made the way. Sometimes it's made the way champagne or some beers are made, where the fermentation is allowed to continue in the bottle. Other times they do like some beers and they put CO2 in the bottle.
Mm.
And I mean, it could be nice. You see, sake in Japan has this image of being an old man's drink. And so to try to appeal to a broader audience, they do things like that. And I've had some sake like that that's been carbonated, and it's nice. And other times it just tastes like a bad cream soda. Get dry, but it's more of a recent thing.
Okay,
Okay.
gotcha. Okay, good to know.
Oh, Jack, what do you got?
Yeah, I just had a question about that. You brought up the age thing, and the movie left you kind of with the feeling that young people are not sake drinkers like the older Japanese are, and it seems to be changing the industry. Is that why there's flavored sake and sparkling sake, and it's an attempt, because without that it is kind of, I shouldn't say going away, I don't think it would disappear, but it's certainly diminishing.
It's diminishing considerably, Jack. The number of breweries declines every year, and it's been rather steep since the 1950s. And there's lots of reasons for that, but mostly people switch to beer and wine in Japan. Beer, for instance, does not have that old man or old person image. It's a young person's drink. It's refreshing. That's the image, at least. It's lower alcohol content than sake, so people can drink more of it. So yeah, the industry's having a hard time. It's getting a little bit better. Since the 1980s, they've developed these more higher end sake, and those are getting more and more popular each year. But really, the sake industry in Japan is looking outside of the country to try to for its fortunes. So exporting to the United States or China or Europe.
Similar to that, the question, Japan has really made strides in, I'll call it Japanese Scotch. They call it whiskey, but it's, I guess, closest to Scotch. But it's really very, very good and well made and well researched, and they're really developing it well. As that also made it tough for the sake industry among the Japanese? Is that an influence at all? I mean, I know they were always Scotch drinkers, but has their own house brands affected it?
I mean, I think that's probably true to some extent, but I think the major for sake is beer and wine rather than distilled spirits in Japan. That's my sense anyway, in terms of market share, at least.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, you can definitely see the kind of love and caring that goes into some of those whiskeys, and that's also true for sake too. There's some I mean, it's evident from the movie that some breweries really, really work hard to make it a handcrafted item.
So you talked about sake being, I guess good for a year. So once you open it, how long can you keep it open? I mean, like, how long does it last?
Yeah, about a week. You just keep it refrigerated,
Okay.
That's fine. And there are some aged sakes, but those are designed specifically to be aged. So there are certain brands. I don't think I've ever seen them for sale in the United States, but there's certain brands of aged sake, and they're kind of like a brandy. The color of it is yellowish brownish, and they have that kind of a brandy taste to them.
Interesting.
But generally, yeah, you want to drink your sake within a week.
So I'm curious where in Japan your research has taken you, and do you have a favorite region of Japan?
Right. Well, I spent a lot of time in Kyoto for many years. And so when I go back to Japan, I try to not to go to Kyoto. I mean, I love it, but I want to see other places. For my sushi book, I went to places that had very historic types of sushi that I wanted to try. Because, I mean, that's another thing about benefit of food history research is you got to eat, you got to drink. And so I went to places that were more famous for traditional types of sushi that you don't see anyplace else. So that's what I like to do. I'd like to get off the beaten path and go to the countryside. And I recommend it to anyone to get a rail pass. And the most expensive part of your trip to Japan will be the plane ticket over there. But if you buy your rail pass beforehand and you are willing to sleep in a Japanese inn, then I mean you can, or a lower star hotel, you can do very, very well in terms of cost. Yeah.
I would love to do that at some point.
I know, sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, Scott.
Is
Hi.
location in Japan? I'm sorry, did I?
I'll let you guys
Scott, did
duke
you
it
want-
out.
Is-
Scott has been told to wait at all times.
no, go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
The question I had in the movie when he's going, the heir apparent, I guess, is going around trying to get people to buy that breweries. If that's, are they called breweries or what are they?
Sure. Yeah. Sake
Okay.
breweries. Yeah.
Though I didn't catch the terms. Part of the problem with that movie was the subtitles were a little hard to read for some of us. But it sounded like they were talking about, so this is your, and they had a name for it, and then this is your dry one. So do they have sweet sakes and dry sakes, and do they have different names for them? I mean, and then they show the wall of sakes, and I think I would just run away crying. I don't understand what I guess it's like a craft brewery.
Yeah.
Right. And there are sweet sake, and then there are very dry sake. So just like you have some very sweet wines and very dry wines, that's very true for sake. And of course, you know, some people have a preference for dry. I think that's the preference, the dominant preference for the higher end sake is that they're very dry. They have a sort of melon bouquet to them, and almost like drinking a wine, if you will. But there are, you know, more sweeter sake. The sake of Kyoto is a little more sweeter. The sake of the northern parts of Japan tends to be a little bit drier. It all depends on personal preference, really. But there is a great variety in sake. That's another thing that's very remarkable about it is depending on the brewery and depending on how it's made. There's some sake that use natural yeasts as well, and those can be rather gamey. Or maybe you've heard of the Japanese word umami, which is a fancy way of saying MSG or savory. That there's some sake like that. As a matter of fact, there's one in Lawrence, available in Lawrence, called Kurosawa. I'll put it into chat here. And they use a little more traditional method, and it's a bit more gamey, very flavorful type of sake.
Is it possible to get the brand that the movie was about here, or is that just in Japan?
You know, I don't think so in Lawrence, unless you have to order it, and you'll have to order it through an online retailer because of the nature of Kansas liquor laws and how the distribution works. Because I wanted to go to a liquor store in town, and I said, I want to order this sake from Arizona. There's a really good brewery in Arizona. And the guy checked the list, and he said, no, we can't order that. We can only order these brands because of the way the laws work. He explained it all to me. It was all kind of over my head. But if you want to look for, you know, good sake, more expensive one, then that's a good alternative, is to go online and see the number of online sake stores, and they'll send it to you. If you
Also-
want to, go ahead, Linda. Yeah.
I was just going to say, also, I think I hear you saying sake for the plural. Is that also, is it sake for both singular and plural?
Yeah, I mean, it's like any Japanese word, or most any Japanese word is singular and plural. So like samurai, for instance, that could be singular or plural. Sake could be singular and plural. But sometimes I find myself saying sakes,
But technically,
samurais, technically you don't need to do that, except, I mean, some of these words have entered into English, and you can certainly say sakes. There's a pretty good sake from Oregon called Momokawa. I'll put that into chat. If you were to buy one in Lawrence, that's probably the one I would recommend. They have a regular blend, and they have this one, Nigori Sake. Nigori Sake is a cloudy sake, in that some of the sake remains unfiltered. Usually they filter the sake, and that clarifies it. They filter it and then they clarify it. And Nigori Sake, it's not fully clarified, so it's cloudy, it's milky colored. And that's more of a sweeter sake, come to think of it, the Nigori Sake.
You mentioned
Really
both.
have a taste.
You mentioned Oregon and Arizona.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that sake was made really outside of Japan. I mean, is it made frequently outside? Is it just Japan and US, or where all is sake made?
Oh, wow. I mean, historically it was Japan, of course, but lately there's breweries opening everywhere. Scotland, there's breweries I think in Mexico, North America, Europe, certainly. There's one that opened outside of Paris recently.
Huh.
And then some of them are by craft brewers in America who want to try sake, and then they open sake breweries. Others are by Japanese companies. So this very famous brand of sake called Dasai, I'll put it in the chat. Dasai is opening up a brewery near the Culinary Institute of America in upstate New York. And that'll be open soon. And that's probably one of the most famous brands in Japan. They win lots of awards, and it's very good sake. Very expensive stuff too. But yeah,
So-
people have been brewing sake in California for decades.
Yeah, I could see that. I guess they have a long history of Japanese people living there, and that would make sense. So you talked about, don't buy the cheap sake, don't buy the most expensive sake. So how cheap is cheap, and how expensive is that? Is expensive.
I mean, actually, in terms of price point, sake is pretty good compared to wine, I think a bottle of Momokawa, the last time I bought it, was, I don't know, $17. It's probably gone up since then, but I think that stands up pretty well compared to a $17 bottle of wine, at least the ones that I buy. I don't have much luck. But yeah, I think in terms of price point, it's pretty good compared to wine. So let's say $17 will get you a good sake. Below that, maybe kind of want to avoid.
Okay.
And I'm talking full-size bottles. There are also smaller bottles that are available. And those are all traditional serving sizes. We could talk about that if you wanted to. But the wine size bottles, like 17, good kind of middle point. And then above that, I mean, they can get very expensive, $50, $60, $70 sometimes.
Wow.
And up.
Yes,
Yeah, Jack.
Just a kind of cultural question, because that was, to me, kind of the most interesting thing of the movie, I mean, I enjoyed learning about sake, but the culture of it. These people obviously left and lived there for 6 months. Is that, and I assume it was because they have difficulty getting people, they've found them far away and they come there. If you have a larger operation or a non-handmade operation, do they like live at home and come to work each day like we would here in a winery? This was, I assume, not a usual brewery.
Right. So if you were to buy sake from a major brewery, chances are it's made in the Kobe, Osaka area, and it's brewed year round, and they have a full-time staff. So companies like Shotobai or Ozeki or something like that, those big companies, they have year-round staff. But smaller breweries, yeah, they hire people for that 6 months period. And historically, that worked out well, because those people who were working there in the sake brewery for six months, the rest of the year, they're farmers, they're fishermen. And so in the off season, they would traditionally go to a brewery and work. And this started off in the 17th century, or these groups. And over time, these groups organized and they developed their own styles. They have their own leadership. And year after year, they go to the similar breweries and they have a kind of like brewing style. And so the brewery owner will tell the top person, who's called the toji, that, you know, these are the sake I want you to brew. And then the toji will take over and his team will run the show. And now there's a half dozen of these different toji groups in Japan. But you know, most breweries, I mean, most of the big ones, you know, they kind of ignore this tradition. They're outside of that tradition, but the smaller ones are still, you know, following it.
I have a question just kind of related to that a bit. I think sometimes, at least in the US, we have this view of Japan as kind of holding on to traditional practices and the old ways of doing things more than maybe other places in the world, as compared to the US, certainly. Do you think there's truth in that at all? And if so, why is that?
Well, there's certainly the rhetoric of that, you know. There's certainly the cultured appearance that something is never changing, that it's centuries old, that it's existed for 1,000 years. And there are a lot of old things in Japan. Nobody can deny that. The oldest wood building in the world is in Japan. Things like that. So that's undeniable. But if you start looking at those traditions over time, like I do as a historian, you see that there are changes, you know, over time. Sushi is a great example. There's this type of sushi that's made out of carp, and it's an ancient type of sushi. It's supposed to have been made around the 8th century. And many people will say, oh, you know, this is something that's existed since the 8th century. And they might be right, because a similar type of sushi is made back then, and it's still made today in this one region. But if you start investigating the history of it, you see that the recipe has changed even in the last century. And people now use completely different tools and implements to make that sushi. So yeah, it's kind of similar, but it's also very different. Just to say that it's been 1,000 years, kind of, it elides the truth of all the changes that have happened over time.
But it also has the oldest people,
I like
doesn't it? Doesn't it also
I
have
don't
the
know about
oldest
that.
people?
No. No, I don't think so. No. Maybe the oldest pottery.
Yeah.
You have the oldest pottery, but not the oldest people. No, not
Does
at
it
all.
matter what you drink your sake out of? I mean, does it change the flavor? I'm sure it changes the experience, but they're all, you know, like little pottery things, but.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional, well, one of the traditional ways was to drink it out of a very shallow cup. That's the way people drank it in the medieval period, a very shallow cup. And sometimes if you go to a shrine in Japan today in the New Year's time, they'll give you a shallow cup of sake
Mhm.
and you can enjoy it. But later on, when this bar culture in the 18th, 19th century, then these smaller cups became more prevalent. It does affect the taste of sake,
Mhm.
just like with wine or with
Right.
beer. You want to pair it with the right glass. So you do have some sake snobs who will drink, out of this specially designed sake glass from the glassmaker Riedel. And then it's just, this is the way to drink sake, but or you could drink it out of a wine glass. That's fine too. So that's another little experiment you can try. Buy a bottle of sake, try it at different temperatures, try it at with different glassware or ceramics, and see how it changes for you. It's all good.
Yeah.
That sounds like a fun experiment.
Yeah. Have a sake party.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes, people get so caught up in trying to be authentic and preserve tradition. And really, if you start looking at it, those traditions are rather recent, and that really inhibits creativity. So it's just gotta just go for it and try it out.
Can we
Make it
assume
your
that
own.
in the movie, when they were sitting at their meals, they were always drinking clear liquid? Am I assuming they were drinking sake with their meals, or is that incorrect?
Yeah, probably something. Those guys have to get up in the middle of the night to take care of their
Yeah.
brewing. So I would be surprised if they're drinking sake every time at night. But yeah, I think it's important that they taste what they make. Some brewers say that.
They did
But-
seem to be celebrating a bit and getting maybe a little bit looser after their dinner, when they paused and had looked like quite a few beverages, and then returned to work. They were a little bit more enthusiastic, it seemed.
Well then. I would deduce from that, not that it's not water in those glasses.
So back to the whole thing, where on the traditional one, breweries that do it in 6-month segments or whatever it was, why would they not have shifts? Or is that just, I mean, it just sort of cries out to have a couple of shifts come in. I understand you want people have to be there all day because of the nature of the brewing process, but it just seemed weird that it just was the same people dealing with it.
Well, I mean, those people are experts, and if it seems like if you're going to have a shift, you're going to have people who are just doing it part-time, or they're not really fully engaged in it. And there are people who do that, probably locally. There are people who pitch in, but if you're going to be brewing something with a very high level of craftsmanship, you want to monitor it. You're the baker who wants to monitor how the baking is going, how the yeast is rising, and things like that. And you can't really teach that stuff very easily. For example, I mean, they're looking at the ferments sometimes, and there are tens and tens of words for the different kinds of bubbles that come up out of that. And that's not something you can read in a book. You have to learn it from someone who knows that sort of skill set. And so there's a lot of physicality that people work on, besides the sort of intellectual knowledge, the sort of physical side of it all that we also use in cooking. The taste of the sake, the smell of it, to know when to progress on to the next stage. So you really have to have people who are experts in that kind of thing. You just can't somebody off the street and tell them to do something advanced like that. Maybe they can shift bottles around, but they can't take charge of critical stages in the brewing.
Well, I was struck by how physical the whole process was. I mean, they were, they had the bags that were taking up the stairs, and I guess the manipulation of the rice and all that kind of stuff. It was exhausting watching it, you know,
Right,
from my
yeah.
perspective. But it was amazing that just the physical requirement that was part of the whole process.
Yeah. And historically, you know, when Japan's sake industry commercialized that, that's when it became a male-dominated profession.
Mm.
But if we go back in time, and here's a good example of how traditions change, right? We think of the tradition today as being a male-dominated profession, and I think that's the way it's always been. If we go back to the 14th, 15th century, there were a lot of women involved in brewing. We have images of women selling sake in the market. We have records of women owning breweries. But when sake business really took off commercially and the scale changed and the technology changed, that's when you had these seasonal workers come in, and that's when you needed that real raw physical labor, and women get sidelined from sake brewing.
Are there, is Toji, is that the name of the sort of brewmaster? Are there female Tojis today?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are. There's about six or seven of them. Yeah. So very few, still very few.
That is one thing I noticed, yeah, in the documentary, that it was definitely a male-dominated workspace.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a couple of women cooking the meals for them, so they were there,
Right.
but
And I would bet in a lot of breweries, it's the women who are running books and taking care of the site, to the physical labor. So it's not like women are totally excluded, but the image today is that, oh, it's a very masculine thing, but that's historically inaccurate.
Mhm.
I was reading your biography on the KU web page from the Department of History, and it says something in there about like you're making a link between tradition and like authority or power structures, maybe kind of related to what you've already touched on, but can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's all boils down to who says what is authentic. Really, I mean, who is that's telling us we can't do what we want to do? Who is setting all these rules up about what is true and what is false? You know, and rather than take that, you know, as a given, I like to ask, what do people gain out of those traditions? So a lot of my work is trying to understand what people gain out of these claims about Japanese tradition.
Okay.
Whether it relates to food or something else. So, for example, the Japanese government in 2012, was it 2012? Yeah, 2012, petitioned UNESCO to have Japanese food listed as an intangible cultural asset. And on the surface, that sounds like a really good idea, but when you think about it, why is it that the Japanese government is doing that at this particular moment? Well, part of it is to tell the world Japanese food is safe after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And part of it is to shift dietary trends within the country. And part of it is to affect the balance of the trade more favorably for Japan. Because I mean, Japan is a highly advanced nation, but they require 60% of their food from outside the country. In other words, their sustainability in terms of food is only 40%. So they're always trying to move the needle, get people to buy more Japanese food, get more people in Japan to eat more Japanese food rather than imported food. And so this whole idea of defining traditional food played into that very well.
Okay, interesting. I see.
Well, and I think before we got on, I was asking, so what drew you to this line of study? I thought that was really interesting. If you want to share kind of how you got into studying both Japanese food and sake and all the wonderful classes that you teach on this.
Yeah, I mean, I was a child in the 1980s, and that's when the sushi boom was going on in the United States. And you all might remember Molly Ringwald eating sushi in detention in the Breakfast Club. And I can't remember the name of the actor, but he turns to her and he says, "What is that?" And she says, "Sushi." And he says, "Sushi? What's sushi?" And I was sitting in the audience at the time, and I was wondering, "What's sushi?" Sitting up in my chair. And she explains, "Oh, it's fish and rice and a little soy sauce." And he says to her, "Fish and rice? You eat that and you won't have a boy's tongue in your mouth?" You know?
Oh God, that's gross.
And so I was intrigued by that. I dragged a friend out to eat sushi. We got served at a Japanese restaurant, didn't know how to eat it. The waiter taught us, and I kind of wanted to learn more about it, and put that aside and did other things. And then when I was in Japan, I had the chance to work at a Japanese restaurant in Kyoto, because that was always something I wanted to do, and really discovered more about this very, very rich food culture. And Japanese food is my favorite, and there's just so much to learn about it. So I've kept at it for more than 2 decades, researching about different topics related to Japanese food, from sushi to sweets to now sake.
Right.
Do you eat at, oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I bet you give good dinner parties.
Yeah.
Oh, not really. I'm a hermit.
Do you eat at any sushi restaurants in town, or, I mean, having?
Yeah, I'll take the Fifth Amendment on that. I'm not going to
Okay.
make any.
You're not gonna give us your
restaurant
favorite?
recommendation. No.
It's probably like Dylan's, sushi counter.
Well, I mean, you read my book and you'll see what I say about Dylan's Sushi Counter
Oh,
Uh-oh.
okay.
and Hy-Vee as well.
Uh-oh.
I mean, it is what it is. It is what it is.
Yeah.
And some people like it a lot.
With wine, it says on the label or whatever, and hints of blackberry and smoke or whatever. Is sake like that, or does it have? Can experts tell those things about sake?
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, it's usually in Japanese, but you can learn about the rice that was used, how much that rice was milled. In other words, how much that rice was polished, because that determines legally the quality of the sake. The better sake, in that case, 70% of the rice has been milled away, and you just have a very core starch of the rice that's used in the sake. So you can learn the type of rice that's used. You can learn how much it's been milled. You could learn about the type of yeast that's been used. You could learn all kinds of information. And then some bottles too, they have some suggestions about pairing. You can certainly learn how dry or sweet that sake is. And its alcohol content too, that gives you some information. Most sake is about 13%. They make it at about 20 and then they water it down to about 13%.
Is it, highly regulated? I mean, it sounds like there's different grades and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's legally defined about if you want to qualify for the certain grades, you have to you have to mill your rice at a certain level.
Okay.
And there's also terroir type notions in Japan about certain places. So certain parts of Japan will put up standards.
Sorry. That was my phone.
No, I was just saying that there are also like certain regions that have their own standards about sake too.
That makes sense.
I have another question just because I'm clueless. In that movie, there are a lot of scenes where they're hand manipulating the rice over screens, I think. What is that, the polishing, or what are they doing there?
Yeah, that's a real critical step in sake making. And it goes back to the point of when I said that sake is more like a beer than it is a wine. What's going on there is they're putting a mold on top of that rice, and they're spreading it out on this table. And the reason they're doing that is they need to take the starch that's in the rice and turn it into sugar. Now with beer, the brewers will malt barley or something else, and that'll unlock the sugars in the grain and make them available for fermentation. You can't do that with rice because you've polished away the bran. So they use this mold. The mold's called koji, and it's used in all sorts of Japanese foods, from soy sauce to miso. It's an incredible thing. It's Japan's national mold. Is koji. That's how it's been built. It's advertised. Japan's national mold. And this mold plays a very crucial role because it breaks down all the starches and it transforms those starches into sugars. And with sugars, you can have your yeast and you have your alcohol. And so that's a really crucial step. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that mold grows evenly. That rice is very warm and they want to spread that mold around. And depending on how long that takes, it can take 30 to 40 hours. They'll manipulate that rice. Sometimes they wrap it up really tight so it keeps warm. Other times they spread it out. They eventually put it into small containers and they stack those up. But that's a really key part of the process, is making koji. Koji refers to the mold, and then it also refers to the rice that's inoculated by the mold. And the rice becomes very, it'll become kind of furry. The mold is white, and it has a nice chestnut aroma too. But it's a key step. And there's nothing mysterious about koji. Koji is everywhere. It's all around us. It'll grow in the United States. It'll grow in Japan. But it's absolutely essential for sake brewing, or soy sauce.
So is that the part that would be comparable to, in Scotch, floor malting the barley, that is done in bigger places by a machine rather than by hand? I would assume that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, malting occurs with Scotch or with beer. You know, I think when you first don't you make kind of like a beer-like thing when you're making a Scotch initially. I mean, you have to somehow some way of unlocking the sugars from the grain.
But
So
only a handful of distilleries anymore actually floor malt it, where they spread it out and push it. Everybody does it in a vat, and I'm assuming that that's the same thing with sake, that the bigger companies are not doing what they were doing there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
They have machines that do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the smaller breweries or the home brewers, it's very easy to home brew sake. You can buy the koji in the mail. I've done it, and you'll get a really nice product. It just takes you about a month to make that sake. But if you do any kind of home brewing, you know, it's rather easy. It's kind of an easy thing. The hardest part is making that koji at the beginning.
And that grows on the rice?
Yeah. The brewers will take something that looks kind of like a Parmesan cheese shaker, and they put it all around the rice and then spread it out, and then mold grows. And they just want to make sure that it grows in the right way and that it grows evenly, and that you know, it's taken care of. And that takes 30 to 40 hours. And then they have their koji. And koji is really remarkable. People are using it in all kinds of things these days in the United States. Besides sake brewing, they're using it in charcuterie. They're using it as a sweetener, because hey, you've unlocked all those great sweet, all that glucose in the rice. You can use that instead of sugar. And then besides having that glucose unlocked, you also unlock umami. You also unlock this savoriness. So it's great. People use it to tenderize meat. They tenderize fish with it. And you know, for an aged steak, they'll do that with koji. They'll spread it on top of the meat and let it age that way. And so it's got a lot of fans in the United States, growing more and more. And people use it for pickles too.
That's interesting.
Is koji used for making the miso as well?
Oh yeah, it's used for miso. It's used for soy sauce. It's used for so many things in Japan. Pickles. It's sometimes if sushi use koji. It's really indispensable. Used for sweets too.
I did go ahead, if anyone is interested, I posted a link to Uishi, the history of sushi, that you can put on hold here at the library if you would like. And yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rath. It's been very fascinating. I've
Yeah, it's really
learned so
great.
much.
Should we-
I'm definitely going to keep in mind those seven facts about sake.
That's right. We all want to
Great.
be
Great.
sake hipsters, right? That's
Yeah.
our goal. Well, so should we take a vote on, should we rank the movie? I think we usually do this at the end of these programs where it's 1 to 5, 5 being fabulous and 1 not being so fabulous. So with a show of hands, what do you got?
I'll say,
I'm going to give it a
I'd do it like a 3.5 or 4. It was good. It was so relaxing.
yes, it was
The discussion was fantastic and the movie was good too, but it was so mellow that it was, after a day of work, I was like ready to settle in. So I love the conversation was really fabulous though. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you
we
so much.
appreciate it.
Everybody's questions too. It's great.
Yeah.
Found it interesting that you said it was so soothing, Kathleen, because I'd seen it before on PBS, I think had it on POV or something like that. And so I lay down to watch it instead of the election returns and it put me to sleep.
Yeah.
But it was very good. I did enjoy it, but it was very highly soothing. It may be my
Probably
had
better
the-
for your health than the
I had the
election
exact
returns.
opposite reaction. I had the exact opposite. I was so concerned that they weren't going to make it, that the end of this story was going to be, it went out of business. And it was so culturally affected me that I was tense during, I loved it.
Huh.
But
Oh, that's
maybe that's why I rated it a 5. I just
Yeah.
was really drawn into the culture and the dynamics of working that hard to make something and then have half your crew leave and what are they going to do next year? And it was very nerve-wracking to me.
Huh.
Do we know if they're still in business? That was made in 2015.
I looked up just to see if you could buy their sake, and you can buy it online. So they seem to still be in business.
That's great.
Yeah. And they had, there was one bottle that was like $480, but another bottle was only $34. So,
So
reasonable.
don't buy the cheap one, don't buy the expensive one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They had
Somewhere in the
some-
middle.
Yeah.
It's great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. That was a really fun conversation, and we will put the recording up online if you didn't take notes and want to go back and relearn the 7 things you need to know to be all knowing about sake. So but yeah, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again. I think our next event is tomorrow at Watkins Museum that Jack has organized for us. And so we'll see what that brings. But have a wonderful evening, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Roth.